Okay, well then, look, without saying anything more, I'll hand over to Clodagh. So thanks very much, Clodagh, again.
Thanks so much, Mihal, and thanks everyone for having me here today. So I'm going to talk quite briefly, just for maybe about 10 minutes, and I'm going to share a couple of slides just to speak about the work that we do at Community Law Mediation. And then we can maybe discuss potential ways we can collaborate. And I'd actually really love to hear more about the work that you're all doing as well, which is really important and interesting. So I'm just going to share these slides now. Okay, can you see that okay? Yep, perfect, thank you. Okay, so as Mihal said, my name is Clodagh Daly and I work with Community Law and Mediation's Centre for Environmental Justice. So we were set up in 1975 as part of the, oh, sorry, let me just, that's better. Okay, so we were set up in 1975 as part of the campaign for civil legal aid. And today we assist more than 4,000 people per year through the provision of free legal advice clinics, community education and outreach, mediation, and then advocacy on policy and law reform issues and for the protection of rights already enshrined in the law. So we're based physically in Coolock in North Dublin and in Limerick, but we actually operate nationally now since COVID. So the majority of our free legal advice clinics take place by phone or over Zoom. And then we also offer outreach clinics as well, where sometimes we will partner with a community organisation and we will deliver those clinics in person on the ground, so to speak. And so what brought, because I suppose traditionally community law mediation, having been around for such a long time, was working on areas of law that were more traditional. So across issues like housing, social welfare, employment, equality, and discrimination. And so our services, I suppose, work to assist people who experience exclusion and inequality most. And what brought my colleagues into environmental justice was realizing, in fact, that the issues that we're presenting to our free legal advice clinics were environmental issues, but we just hadn't been applying an environmental lens to those problems. So, for example, we were seeing that families were coming in whose homes were being repeatedly flooded and they could no longer get insurance, or people's health was being impacted due to air pollution and that was being impacted by where they lived. And so in 2021, we set up the Centre for Environmental Justice. And what we're trying to do in the centre is to connect the dots, I suppose, between social justice and environmental issues. Within this really critical decade for 1.5, as we know, we have very unforgiving deadlines to meet in terms of the climate crisis. But then equally thinking about it in terms of, not only a climate or an environmental crisis, but one that's so connected to our health, housing, jobs, and debt. And so really we're talking about a very human crisis. And my colleagues as well were very kind of conscious about the potential negative impacts of climate action or environmental policy more broadly if it weren't to take the needs of communities most affected into account. And so, we know that people who've contributed least to the climate crisis are potentially at risk of most being impacted by both climate change and climate action, because communities who are under-resourced have fewer resources to cope with pollution or the impacts of climate change, and have, fewer choices about where and how they live, and less visibility in the shaping of policy responses, but certainly not less agency. And so that's kind of what we try to do through our free legal advice clinics, is to kind of bring that empowerment. So I'm just going to go through a couple of issues that have presented to our free legal advice clinics in the 2 years that we have been here. So air pollution is one issue that we've seen across the country, in urban as well as in rural areas. That figure needs to be updated. Recent research by the Irish Heart Foundation has shown that more than 2,000 people per year across the island of Ireland die prematurely as a result of air pollution. And air pollution impacts some people more than others because of where they live, where they can afford to live, and then the level and quality of healthcare that they have access to. What's kind of striking in Ireland is that the World Health Organization in 2021 updated their air quality guidelines, and they're quite explicit now that there are no safe levels of air pollution. But EU or Irish law have not been updated to reflect this. And interestingly, there are cases being taken against governments in Germany and in Belgium, challenging their governments for failure to align their air quality laws with the best available science. There was a really sad case a couple of years ago where a 9-year-old in the UK, Clodagh, died as a result of air pollution. And that was discovered through an inquest after she had passed away. And this is a quote from her mother, who said, "We were desperate for anything to help her. I would have moved straight away. I would have found another hospital for her and moved. I cannot say it enough. I was desperate. She was desperate." So her and her family lived close to one of the most polluted streets in London. And Clodagh suffered from severe asthma, but they weren't aware at the time, unfortunately, that air pollution was really exacerbating that. Another issue is illegal dumping and toxic waste. There's a really excellent report by Youth Work Ireland, which was published in 2020, and I can share that afterwards if anyone's interested. And it shows that 71% of landfill sites and waste incinerators across the country are located in areas below the national average of deprivation. The next issue is one that is familiar to a lot of us, I'm sure, with energy bills just through the roof over the last few months. Energy poverty is an issue that is presented to our clinics in a number of ways. The ESRI have reported most recently that up to 40% of the population are experiencing or are at risk of falling into energy poverty. Those living in social and private rental housing, unemployed, single-parent families, and members of the traveller community are disproportionately impacted. There was a 2019 report by National Traveller Maps, which showed that more than 75% of travellers live in energy poverty, spending more than a quarter of their income on energy bills. And that was in 2019, prior to our current energy poverty crisis. Energy poverty is, of course, really closely connected to air pollution. We've seen that households who are either living in energy poverty or who are very close to or who are at strong risk of living in energy poverty are likely to burn solid fuels, so like wood or turf, without necessarily being aware of the health and environmental impacts of doing so. And so air pollution and energy poverty are not only environmental issues, but they're really issues of housing justice and I suppose economic justice as well. Climate justice is an issue that is also presenting increasingly to our free legal advice clinics. The image in the slide here is what Dublin would look like in a 2-degree warmed world. So more than 40% of our population lives within 5 kilometers of the coast, and as our coastline erodes and as sea level rise continues, this poses a significant challenge, and particularly to local authorities. There is a really interesting case that we've been watching in the UK. It's a village called Fairborn in Wales, which is set to be decommissioned by 2050. So over the next less than 30 years, I suppose, the village is going to be dismantled, and everything in that town, so the homes, businesses, shops, electricity pylons, gas pipelines, everything will be taken out of the land, and the land will be turned into tidal salt marsh. So a lot of locals in the area are trying to resist this and are calling for provisions to be made to allow people to stay living where they're from. And it's created a serious problem for local authorities in the area and for the UK government as a whole, because at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there are no plans for compensation and there are no plans for resettlement. So it's kind of a very stark example of what is, the risks that communities may be exposed to faced with sea level rise. And as I mentioned earlier, we have seen a couple of similar cases presented to our own clinics. And another issue where this is arising is in relation to planning. So, for example, where infrastructure such as roads are granted planning permission without carrying out an adequate environmental impact assessment or without taking Ireland's climate obligations into account. And then finally, the other issue that's presented is lack of access to green space. So this map, and I know, sorry, this is kind of Dublin centric, but this map shows the comparison in tree coverage between different parts of Dublin. So we can see that Dublin 4 has 1 street tree for every 8 residents, whereas Dublin 1 has 1 tree for every 34 residents. And so there is, a lot less green space and fewer trees in areas of socioeconomic deprivation. We know, and especially since COVID and living through lockdowns, that this has really significant mental and physical health impacts. It affects the air that we breathe, and it also acts as a flood barrier in the case of heavy rainfall and potential sea level rise. And we know that access to nature is important for all of us. So that's another one that we've seen where, for example, limited green space is subject to developments such as car parks, and there's a lot of local contestation about how green spaces should be used appropriately and who gets to enjoy that green space. So in terms of our policy and law reform advocacy, we have 4 priority areas that we work across. The first is, and they kind of flow from our free legal advice clinics essentially. So the first is on air pollution. We are kind of working on advocacy on the EU's Ambient Air Quality Directive, which is currently being revised. And the government have committed to revising their Clean Air, to bring in a new Clean Air Act. So we're calling for World Health Organization air quality guidelines to be adopted there by kind of 2030 at the latest. On energy poverty, we are calling for energy poverty legislation. So the government published an energy poverty action plan in December of 2022. From our perspective, it's quite weak. It doesn't contain any legally binding targets at all or obligations, and the measures that are proposed aren't really measurable or time bound. So we would like to see, I suppose just much stronger legislation to ensure long-term political commitment towards the full eradication of energy poverty. And we would like to see really strong improvements to the national retrofit plan as well, particularly around social housing. At the moment, I believe the target is to retrofit around 20% of Ireland's social housing stock by 2030. So we would really like to see Ireland's entire social housing stock be retrofitted to about a B2 standard by the end of this decade. On climate justice, so we are monitoring the climate action plans consistently, and Ireland's long-term climate action strategy has just been published, or a draft has just been published as of last week. So we are looking at those at the moment and assessing their adequacy. And then on access to justice, so that's kind of a core priority across the full organisation, making sure that communities we work with have access to justice. And unfortunately, in the case of environmental cases, there are attempts, as many of you will know, to restrict access to justice. So we are trying to influence that process and make sure that the new Planning and Development Bill does not do that and is actually coherent with the Aarhus Convention as well. So the other thing we do is we do provide training. So we provide Know Your Rights training where we can deliver our training on, for example, local authority obligations. And we've been doing this because a lot of the issues that have been presenting to our clinics are a lack of enforcement on the part of local authorities. And that may be because local authorities are really under-resourced and may not have enough staff or may not have a designated staff member to kind of deal with environmental problems exclusively. But nonetheless, we have definitely seen a kind of pattern in that regard through the free legal advice clinics. So we do deliver Know Your Rights trainings around local authority obligations. Later on this year, we'll be running a 3-part webinar series on the Aarhus Convention. So that's essentially about people's procedural environmental rights, your right of access to environmental information, your right of your right to public participation in environmental decision making, and then your right to access justice and for legal remedy in the case of a breach of environmental law. So that will be taking place in October this year. And in some cases, there have been, for example, community groups who have approached us who are working on a submission, and we will sometimes be in a position to assist people subject to capacity and kind of subject to what the topic matter is. So we're always open to those types of requests as well, and we're always open to engaging. And even if we can't assist you directly, we can often signpost you to someone who can. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. If you have any questions, I'd really love to hear them, and I'd love to hear more about the work that you are doing as well, and to learn more about all the, because I know Micheál and I've spoken a few times about it, but I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Clodagh. That was really interesting, and good to see all the great work that you're doing. So we have a nice bit of time for questions and discussion. We'll finish up at 12 or potentially before, depending on how many questions there are. So if you have questions, I'd say maybe just you could raise your hand or pop them into the chat, or take yourself off mute as well. There's not too many of us here, but I might just kick off the questions. Just ask, I suppose, in relation to the legal advice that you mentioned, or maybe not legal advice, the clinics, I suppose, is that like, do the clinics result in formal legal advice, or is it kind of maybe more informal? Here are your rights. Here is, giving community groups sort of information in terms of where they stand, or is it legal advice that they can then maybe use?
That's a really good question, actually. Yeah, so it depends, and it's both. So sometimes when queries come in, what we will do is ask people to submit an access to information request, maybe to get more information about the issue that they're dealing with, or a freedom of information request is to collect a bit more data. So sometimes that will be needed. In other cases, it might be that some advocacy is carried out whereby a letter might be sent to, for example, a local authority, and sometimes that can be enough to resolve an issue. We did have an interesting issue recently where planning permission was granted for a road, but the original planning permission had been granted back in 1997. And so obviously environmental and climate laws have changed a lot since then. And a community group were really concerned about the local impacts that this road would have. And we initially thought that the case might proceed to court, but in the end it was resolved through mediation. So it can kind of depend on, it mostly depends on what the client wants, what kind of outcome an individual or a community group are looking for themselves. Brilliant.
Yeah. That sounds far ranging. Look, I might stop the recording now just so people can kind of answer questions freely and not be worried about being recorded.